In a small American town called Willow Creek, two men's lives collided in ways no one could have imagined. William Carter, a proud white landowner, hardened by prejudice and blinded by hate. Marcus Johnson, a humble black worker, carrying quiet strength, dignity, and unshakable faith. At first, William's cruelty knew no bounds. He insulted Marcus, humiliated him, and saw him as nothing more than a servant. Marcus endured the pain in silence, holding on to hope that one day things could change. Then came the storm. One terrible night, William's life hung by a thread, and the very man he had despised, Marcus, was the one who saved him. That moment changed everything. Through struggle, forgiveness, and the courage to face their own flaws, the two men built not just a friendship, but a legacy. Together, they transformed a divided town into a beacon of hope. Their journey was not easy. It was filled with trials, heartbreak, and lessons that reached far beyond race, class, or history. But in the end, it proved one timeless truth. No heart is too hard to change, and no past is too broken to be redeemed. This is not just their story. This is a story for every American, black, white, Latino, Asian, Native immigrant, every community that calls this land home. It is a reminder that forgiveness can rebuild what hate tries to destroy. When kindness broke the chains, a story of pain, redemption, and the power of humanity to rise above. In the small town of Willow Creek, tucked away in the rolling hills of the American South, life moved at a slow, steady rhythm. It was a place where people knew each other's names, where front porches were adorned with rocking chairs, and where the echoes of history lingered in every street, every church, and every whisper of the wind. This was the town where William Carter had built his life. William was a man in his late 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, with streaks of gray already settling into his brown hair. He was known in Willow Creek as a successful businessman, the proud owner of Carter Construction, a company that had grown from a modest local service to one of the most reliable construction firms in the county. On the surface, William appeared to have it all: wealth, respect, influence, and a family name that carried weight. But beneath his polished exterior was a man hardened by arrogance. William had inherited his company from his father, and along with it the biases and prejudices that had shaped generations of Carters. Though times had changed and the world around him moved forward, William's heart was anchored to old ways of thinking. He believed in hierarchies of wealth, of class, and most of all of race. Working under William was Marcus Johnson, a black man in his early 40s. Marcus was tall, with powerful hands and a quiet strength that drew people toward him. His skin was dark, his voice deep and calm, and his eyes carried the weight of both hardship and hope. Unlike William, Marcus had not been born into privilege. He grew up in the poorer part of town, raised by his mother, Evelyn Johnson, after his father had passed away when Marcus was just a boy. Evelyn had worked long hours as a housekeeper to put food on the table and instill in her son values of honesty, resilience, and kindness. Marcus had faced prejudice all his life. In school, he was often underestimated by teachers, judged by the color of his skin rather than the sharpness of his mind. In the workplace, he was paid less, given fewer opportunities, and overlooked when promotions came. Yet through it all, Marcus carried himself with dignity. He learned early that bitterness was a chain too heavy to bear. Instead, he found strength in his work, in his faith, and in the unwavering belief that someday, people would see him for who he truly was. William and Marcus's worlds collided when Marcus began working at Carter Construction. From the very beginning, William treated him with disdain. Marcus was often assigned the hardest, dirtiest jobs, the ones others refused to do. William barked orders at him more harshly than at anyone else, cutting him down with sarcastic remarks or mocking him in front of other workers. Marcus never retaliated. He never raised his voice, never argued. Instead, he did his work with quiet efficiency, day after day, even when the weight of humiliation pressed heavy on his shoulders. To his co-workers, Marcus was more than just a laborer. He was a source of inspiration. They admired his ability to endure, his patience, and the quiet dignity he carried with him. At home, however, the toll showed. Marcus lived with his wife, Angela, and their two children, Caleb and Naomi. Angela was his anchor, a woman of grace and strength who encouraged him through the darkest of days. She often reminded him of the lessons his mother had taught. "You can't control how people treat you, Marcus. but you can control how you respond. Your character is your greatest shield. Marcus would sit with his children in the evenings, helping Caleb with his math homework or listening to Naomi's stories from school. He dreamed of a world where his children wouldn't have to endure the same injustices he had faced. Every insult he absorbed, every slight he endured, it was for them. He wanted to carve a path of resilience and hope, even in the face of cruelty. Meanwhile, William lived in a large house on the other side of town with his wife Margaret and their teenage son, Daniel. Outwardly, his life seemed enviable, but within the walls of his home, cracks were beginning to show. William's arrogance and rigid worldview often caused tension. Daniel, unlike his father, questioned the world around him. He had friends from different backgrounds, attended a more progressive school, and often challenged William's outdated beliefs. Their dinner conversations frequently ended in heated arguments, with Margaret silently watching as the divide between father and son grew wider. In the community, William was respected, but not loved. People admired his business success, but often whispered about his temper and arrogance. Marcus, on the other hand, though not wealthy or powerful, was deeply loved. His neighbors trusted him, his church family admired him, and his children looked up to him with pride. The contrast between the two men was stark. One wielded power through money and status, the other through quiet strength and unwavering kindness. Yet destiny, in its mysterious way, was preparing to intertwine their lives in a way that neither could have foreseen. The summer of that year brought with it relentless heat. The air was thick, the nights restless, and tempers across town seemed shorter than usual. William, frustrated by delays in a major project, lashed out more frequently, and Marcus bore the brunt of his anger. Each day the tension grew heavier, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. And then, one night, the storm finally came. A storm that would change everything. The summer heat of Willow Creek was oppressive, the kind that made tempers flare and patience run thin. On the construction site, the sun blazed down on the workers as they hauled bricks, hammered nails, and carried beams. Sweat poured down their faces, and the air was thick with dust and exhaustion. At the center of it all was William Carter, barking orders with a voice that carried more disdain than direction. He strode across the site like a general on a battlefield, his eyes quick to find fault and his tongue sharp enough to cut through a man's spirit. "Faster, Johnson. Is this the best you can do?" he shouted at Marcus, his tone dripping with condescension. "I've seen boys half your age work harder than this. Maybe you're just not cut out for this job." The other workers glanced nervously at Marcus. They had seen this before, William singling him out, ridiculing him in front of everyone. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He simply lifted the heavy beam onto his shoulder and carried it to its place, his movement steady, his silence louder than any words could be. Inside, Marcus felt the sting of humiliation. Each insult chipped away at him, but he held on to his mother's words, the lessons etched into his soul. Dignity is not given, Marcus. It's lived. So he swallowed the bitterness, buried the anger, and kept working. During lunch breaks, the men often gathered under a patch of shade, eating sandwiches and sharing small talk. Marcus usually sat quietly, his lunchbox on his lap. Some of the younger workers admired him, often sneaking glances his way, wondering how he endured the constant mistreatment without ever snapping. One afternoon, a young worker named Ethan finally asked, "Marcus, why don't you ever talk back? The way Mr. Carter talks to you, it ain't right. If it were me, I'd have quit a long time ago." Marcus looked up from his sandwich, his calm eyes meeting Ethan's. "And then what, son?" "I walk away and he finds someone else to treat the same way. My family still needs food, still needs shelter. Sometimes the best fight you can put up is the fight to keep going, no matter how heavy the load." The men fell silent, their respect for Marcus deepening. At home, the strain showed more clearly. Angela noticed the weariness in her husband's eyes, the way his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was watching. She often tried to encourage him, sitting by his side after dinner as the children played nearby. "Marcus," she said softly one evening, her hand resting on his, "I see the weight you carry. You don't have to hold it all in. Talk to me." Marcus sighed, his gaze fixed on the flickering light of the lamp. "It's hard, Angela. Every day he finds a new way to tear me down. Sometimes I wonder if it'll ever end." Angela squeezed his hand. You are stronger than his words. You're showing Caleb and Naomi what it means to endure with dignity. One day they'll look back and understand the strength it took. Don't let his bitterness poison your soul. Her words gave Marcus the strength to keep going, but late at night when the house was quiet, he often prayed silently. He prayed for courage, for patience, and, though he hardly admitted it, for William Carter's heart to change. Meanwhile, William lived in a world of his own making. At home, he carried his arrogance like a badge of honor, often dismissing his wife's gentle reminders to treat people with kindness. Margaret had long ago learned that challenging him only led to arguments. But their son, Daniel, was different. Daniel was 16, full of questions and defiance. He had friends from different backgrounds, kids William didn't approve of. "Why can't you just spend time with people like you?" William asked one evening at dinner, his voice rising. Daniel slammed his fork down. "What does that even mean, Dad? People like me? You mean white people? You don't get it. Times are different. Not everyone sees the world the way you do." William's face flushed red with anger. "Don't you talk to me like that. You don't know the first thing about the world. Respect has to be earned, Daniel, and some people—" He stopped himself, but the venom in his voice was clear. Daniel pushed back his chair, his jaw clenched. "No, Dad, respect is given, or at least it should be. You just don't see it because you don't want to." He stormed out of the room, leaving William fuming and Margaret staring silently at her plate. Deep down, William felt a flicker of unease. His son's words cut closer to the truth than he wanted to admit. Around town, people noticed William's harshness. At the diner, whispers followed him when he walked in. At church, fewer people greeted him warmly. But when Marcus entered those same places, the atmosphere shifted. People smiled, shook his hand, and asked about his family. He was not wealthy, but he was rich in something far greater: respect and love. The contrast gnawed at William, though he would never admit it. He told himself it didn't matter, that success was measured in money and power, not in the opinions of others. But late at night, when he sat alone in his office, staring at the framed photographs of his father and grandfather, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he was losing something more important than he realized. The tension between William and Marcus grew heavier with each passing day. It was like a storm building, dark clouds gathering on the horizon ready to break. The men on the construction site felt it, the community sensed it, and even William's own family could see it. And then, one fateful evening, the storm that had been brewing finally began to take shape. The sky above Willow Creek was restless that evening, painted with streaks of purple and gray as storm clouds gathered on the horizon. The air was heavy, thick with the promise of rain and something more, something ominous. The townspeople sensed it. Doors were closed early, porch lights flickered on, and families gathered inside their homes, listening to the distant rumble of thunder. William Carter sat in his office at Carter Construction, long after most of his men had gone home. Papers were strewn across his desk, contracts, blueprints, invoices, but his mind wasn't on any of them. He sat back in his chair, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at the framed photo of his father on the wall. The elder Carter had been a stern man, a product of his time, who drilled into William the idea that toughness was power, and power was respect. Yet, as the thunder cracked outside and the wind rattled the windows, William felt a strange unease creeping into his chest. He thought about his son Daniel, about the arguments that seemed to grow sharper with each passing week. He thought about Margaret's quiet disappointment, the way she rarely met his eyes anymore. And though he tried to push it away, he thought about Marcus, the man he demeaned daily, yet who never once fought back. The storm grew stronger. Sheets of rain hammered the streets and the wind howled like a wild animal. William finally packed up his things and decided to head home. He pulled his coat tightly around him and stepped into the night, his car parked a block away. The streets of Willow Creek, usually calm and familiar, were now treacherous rivers of water. Branches snapped in the wind, power lines flickered, and the storm raged with a fury no man could tame. William gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove, his knuckles white, the headlights barely cutting through the curtain of rain. He didn't see the tree until it was too late. A massive oak, weakened by the storm, crashed down across the road with a deafening roar. William swerved, the tires skidding across the slick pavement. The car spun violently, crashing through the guardrail before tumbling down a small embankment. The sound of twisting metal and shattering glass filled the night, and then, Silence, broken only by the relentless storm. William's head throbbed, his vision blurred. The airbag had deployed, leaving him gasping for breath. His leg was pinned beneath the dashboard, pain shooting through him with every shallow breath. Panic surged through his chest as he realized he was trapped. "Help!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. The storm swallowed his cry. "Somebody help me!" For the first time in years, William felt powerless. His wealth, his influence, his arrogance, they meant nothing here in the dark, in the rain, in the wreckage of his own pride. Fear gripped him like a vice, and for a fleeting moment he thought of Marcus. He thought of the way he had mocked him, belittled him, treated him as less than human. And now, lying broken in the storm, William realized how fragile he truly was. Back in town, Marcus was closing up his modest workshop. He often took side jobs fixing furniture or repairing tools to earn extra money for his family. As he stepped outside, the storm nearly knocked him off balance, but his sharp ears caught something faint, a cry carried on the wind. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but then he heard it again, desperate, broken. Without hesitation, Marcus grabbed his raincoat and flashlight and followed the sound. His boots splashed through puddles as he hurried down the street, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. When he reached the embankment, his heart clenched. There down the slope was William's car, mangled and smoking, half submerged in the rising water. The cries were clearer now, filled with terror and pain. Marcus didn't think twice. He scrambled down the muddy slope, the rain lashing against his face, and reached the wreckage. Through the shattered glass, he saw William, his face pale and bloodied, his eyes wide with fear. "Marcus." William's voice trembled, a mix of shock and desperation. I can't move, please." Marcus's chest tightened. Here was the man who had ridiculed him, who had humiliated him day after day. The man who had treated him as less than human now looked at him with the raw vulnerability of someone clinging to life. But Marcus didn't hesitate. "Hold on," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the storm. "I'm not leaving you here." With strength born of both determination and compassion, Marcus pried open the twisted door, the metal groaning under his effort. Rain and wind whipped around him, but he pressed on, pulling at the wreckage until the opening was wide enough. Carefully, he reached inside, bracing William as he tried to free his pinned leg. William cried out in pain, his hand clutching Marcus's arm. Don't leave me." "I'm right here," Marcus assured him, his own body straining against the weight of the mangled dashboard. "You're going to make it." After what felt like an eternity, Marcus managed to free William's leg. With one final heave, he pulled him from the car and onto the muddy ground. The rain poured down on them, soaking them both, but Marcus shielded William as best he could, his own body trembling from the effort. Together, they climbed back up the embankment, Marcus practically carrying William when his strength faltered. At the top, headlights cut through the storm. Another driver had seen the wreck and stopped to help. They rushed William into the vehicle, and Marcus climbed in beside him, holding his hand steady as they sped toward the hospital. In the back seat, William looked at Marcus, his voice broken. Why would you help me? After everything I've done to you?" Marcus met his gaze, his eyes steady, his voice quiet but firm. "Because it's the right thing to do. Hate doesn't heal. Only kindness does." William's throat tightened, his chest heavy with shame. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to beg forgiveness, but the words caught in his throat as exhaustion overtook him. His last thought before slipping into unconsciousness was the face of them. The storm had finally passed. By the time the ambulance arrived at Willow Creek General Hospital, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, the night sky still heavy with clouds but calmer than before. The streets glistened with water, reflecting the faint glow of streetlights. Inside the hospital, the sterile white walls hummed with the steady rhythm of machines, the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes and the low murmur of voices. William Carter was wheeled into the emergency room, his face pale, his clothes torn and soaked, his body battered but alive. Doctors and nurses rushed around him, checking his vitals, stitching his wounds, and stabilizing his injured leg. Marcus stood just outside the room, drenched to the bone, mud still streaked across his clothes. He watched through the glass as the medical team worked, his expression unreadable. His hands ached, his muscles throbbed, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that William was alive. After what felt like hours, a doctor stepped out. "He's stable," she said, offering Marcus a tired smile. "It's a miracle he made it out of that wreck. Whoever pulled him out saved his life." Marcus nodded quietly. That's good to hear, Doctor. The doctor tilted her head curiously. Are you family? Marcus shook his head. No, just someone who was there. When Margaret and Daniel arrived at the hospital, panic etched on their faces. Marcus was still there. Margaret rushed to the doctor, her hands trembling as she asked about her husband's condition. Daniel, however, noticed Marcus immediately. Marcus. Daniel's eyes widened. What are you doing here? Marcus gave a small smile. I was nearby when the accident happened. I helped him out. Daniel's face softened, gratitude mixing with relief. You saved him? Marcus nodded. I just did what anyone should do. Margaret turned to him then, her eyes brimming with tears. She had heard of Marcus, of course. William often complained about him at home, dismissing him as lazy or incompetent. But the man standing before her was no such thing. He was steady, humble, and above all kind. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking. Thank you for saving my husband. Marcus simply nodded again, his humility disarming. He's alive. That's what matters. Inside the hospital room, William stirred. The beeping of monitors and the faint scent of antiseptic filled the air as his eyes fluttered open. For a moment he was disoriented, his mind foggy from painkillers and the trauma of the accident. But then the memories rushed back. The storm, the crash, the fear, and Marcus's face pulling him from the wreckage. When his gaze settled on the doorway, he saw Marcus standing there, quiet and calm, his clothes still stained from the night before. Their eyes met, and William felt a jolt in his chest, not from pain but from something deeper. Shame, guilt, recognition. Marcus. His voice was hoarse, weak. You. Marcus stepped closer, but before William could finish, Daniel and Margaret entered the room. Daniel rushed to his father's side, relief flooding his features. Dad, you're okay. Margaret touched William's hand gently, tears streaming down her face. We were so worried. William tried to focus on them, but his eyes kept drifting back to Marcus, standing quietly in the background. For the first time in his life, William Carter felt small, not because of injury or weakness, but because he saw in Marcus something he had never allowed himself to see before: humanity, strength, and grace. Over the next few days, William remained in the hospital recovering from his injuries. Marcus visited quietly, never drawing attention to himself. Sometimes he brought food for the nurses. Sometimes he sat in the waiting area, his presence steady but unspoken. He never asked for thanks, never sought recognition. But William noticed. Lying in that hospital bed, stripped of his authority, unable to bark orders or demand obedience, William was forced to confront the truth of his life. He thought of the years he had spent belittling Marcus, of the harsh words that now echoed in his mind like accusations. Faster, Johnson. Not good enough, Johnson. You'll never be more than this, Johnson. And yet in his moment of greatest weakness, Marcus had been the one to save him. One afternoon, when Margaret and Daniel had stepped out, William asked the nurse to call Marcus into the room. Marcus entered quietly, his step steady, his face calm. William swallowed hard, his pride warring with the words he needed to say. His voice was low, almost broken. Marcus, why? Why did you save me? Marcus's gaze was steady, his answer simple. Because it was the right thing to do. William's throat tightened. After everything I've done to you, everything I've said, you should have left me there. Marcus shook his head. No man deserves to die alone in the dark, not even the ones who hurt us. The words pierced William's heart. He felt his eyes burn, though he fought against the tears. For so long he had believed that strength meant dominance, that power came from making others small. But here was Marcus, a man he had tried to break, showing him a strength far greater than his own. For the first time, William whispered the words he had never spoken before. I was wrong, Marcus. About you. About everything. I treated you like less than a man, and you showed me more humanity than I've ever shown you. I'm sorry. Marcus stood in silence for a moment, then gave a small nod. Apologies don't erase the past, but they can change the future. William closed his eyes, the weight of his past pressing down on him. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar but powerful: humility. Outside the hospital room, Daniel overheard part of the exchange. His heart swelled with pride, not for his father, but for Marcus. For the first time, he hoped his father had truly begun to change. And deep down, William knew that his life would never be the same again. Weeks passed, and the bruises on William Carter's body slowly began to fade. His leg, though still stiff, had been set in a cast, and he was confined to a wheelchair for much of his recovery. The once commanding figure who had barked orders on construction sites now found himself dependent on others for the simplest tasks. Margaret pushed his wheelchair out of Willow Creek General Hospital on a bright morning, the storm that had nearly taken his life now just a distant memory. The sunlight felt different to William. It wasn't just warmth. It was clarity. He had been given a second chance, and deep down, he knew he couldn't squander it. When the Carters arrived home, neighbors came by to check in. Some offered pies, others left flowers, and many simply expressed relief that William had survived. But beneath the polite words lingered unspoken truths. Many in Willow Creek knew of William's harshness, his arrogance, and his prejudice. Some couldn't hide their surprise that Marcus Johnson had been the one to save him. In fact, the story had already spread through town. At the diner, people whispered about it over cups of coffee. At church, it became a point of conversation after Sunday service. The irony was not lost on anyone. The man who had treated Marcus with contempt owed his very life to him. William felt the weight of those whispers. He saw it in the way people looked at him, not with admiration for surviving, but with quiet judgment. For the first time, William realized that respect could not be bought or demanded. It had to be earned. Marcus, meanwhile, went about his life with the same quiet dignity as before. He returned to work, fixed things around town, and cared for his family. He never bragged about saving William, never sought recognition. To him it was simple, he had done what was right. But to the community, Marcus had become something more, a symbol of grace in the face of injustice. One Sunday, William decided to attend church again. Margaret pushed his wheelchair down the aisle, and as they entered, a hush fell over the congregation. People turned their heads, some curious, others cautious, and there, near the front, sat Marcus with Angela, Caleb, and Naomi. His children laughed softly at something Angela whispered, their faces glowing with innocence. William's chest tightened. He remembered the countless times he had torn Marcus down, the way he had looked at him as if he were beneath him, and now, seeing Marcus surrounded by love, William felt the hollowness of his own pride. After the service, William asked Margaret to wheel him over. Marcus looked up surprised as William stopped beside him. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. The congregation watched quietly, sensing the gravity of the moment. Finally, William spoke, his voice unsteady but sincere. "Marcus, I can't undo the things I've said, the way I've treated you, but I want you to know I see you differently now. You showed me a kind of strength I never understood before, and for that, I thank you. I owe you my life." The words hung in the air, raw and heavy. Marcus studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You don't owe me anything, William. What you do from here, that's what matters." The simple response carried more weight than any lecture. It was a challenge, a reminder that redemption wasn't found in words but in actions. In the weeks that followed, William began to change. Slowly at first, but noticeably. On the construction site, he no longer barked at Marcus. In fact, he began to ask for his input, something he had never done before. The workers noticed, whispering among themselves at the sudden shift. One day, William gathered the crew. "From now on," he announced, "this site isn't about who's better or worse. It's about working together, and I want to start by recognizing Marcus. He's been the backbone of this team for years, and it's about time I said it out loud." The men clapped, some grinning, others simply relieved to see the change. Marcus gave a small nod, his humility intact, but inside, he felt a quiet sense of justice, not for himself, but for what it meant to his children, his community. At home, William struggled to bridge the gap with Daniel. His son had seen his arrogance for years and wasn't quick to forgive. But one evening, William wheeled into Daniel's room, his pride set aside. "I know I've been hard on you," William admitted, "and I know I've said things I shouldn't have. But I'm trying, son. I want to be better." Daniel studied him, skepticism in his eyes. "You've said things that hurt a lot of people, Dad, including Marcus. Words don't fix that." William nodded slowly. "You're right. That's why I'm going to show you. I can't erase who I've been, but I can decide who I'll be from now on." For the first time, Daniel's expression softened. He didn't say he forgave him, not yet, but there was a glimmer of hope. The town, too, began to shift in its perception. William Carter, once seen as arrogant and harsh, was humbler now. Not perfect, but different. And while some doubted whether his change would last, others began to believe that maybe, just maybe, grace could break even the hardest of hearts. Through it all, Marcus remained steady. He didn't seek to be anyone's savior, nor did he hold grudges. He simply lived as he always had, with integrity, with love for his family, and with a strength that came not from power, but from kindness. And in the quiet moments, when William thought back to that stormy night, he knew without a doubt Marcus had not only saved his life, he had saved his soul. The crisp air of early autumn swept through Willow Creek, carrying with it a sense of renewal. The leaves turned shades of amber and gold, drifting from the trees to blanket the sidewalks in warmth. For William Carter, the change in season mirrored the transformation within him. The accident had forced him to face truths he had buried for years, but now came the harder part, proving that his change was real. Words were easy, actions were harder, and in a small town like Willow Creek, people remembered everything. Back at Carter Construction, William's return was met with curiosity. The workers exchanged glances as he wheeled himself onto the site for the first time since the accident. The man who had once stormed through barking orders now seemed quieter, more reflective. He called the crew together. "I owe all of you something," William began, his voice steady but softer than they were used to. "For too long, I've treated this job like it was about me, about control, about power. But this company isn't just mine. It's ours, and there's someone here who's been carrying more weight than I ever gave him credit for." He turned his gaze toward Marcus. The men followed his eyes, and silence fell over the group. "Marcus Johnson," William said firmly, "you've worked harder, longer, and with more dignity than anyone here. I've treated you unfairly, and I can't change the past. But from this day forward, things will be different. You're no longer just a laborer. You're my foreman. You'll lead this crew." Gasps rippled through the workers. Marcus, standing at the edge of the group, froze. His broad hands tightened slightly at his sides, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief. For years he had been overlooked, underestimated. Now in front of everyone, William was lifting him up. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice calm but strong. "If I accept this, it won't be for me alone. It'll be for every man here who knows what it's like to be unseen. I'll do the job, but I'll do it my way." With fairness, a round of applause erupted. Some men clapped out of respect for Marcus, others out of relief at the long overdue recognition. For the first time, Carter Construction felt like a team united. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek. The same diner where William had once been the subject of whispers now buzzed with new conversations. People spoke of how he had promoted Marcus, how he had publicly admitted his mistakes. Some remained skeptical, wondering if this was temporary guilt. But others began to see glimmers of real change. William's transformation didn't stop at work. On Sundays, he began to attend church not out of obligation, but with a genuine desire to learn. He listened to sermons with new ears, the words of forgiveness and grace hitting deeper than before. He no longer sat in the front pews as a display of pride. Instead, he humbly joined the congregation, sometimes even sitting near Marcus and his family. One Sunday, the pastor invited members of the community to share testimonies. To everyone's surprise, William wheeled himself forward. He cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the microphone. "For most of my life," he began, "I believed respect came from power, from making yourself bigger by making others smaller. I believed strength meant never bending, never apologizing. But then came a night when I was broken, trapped, helpless, ready to die. And the man I had mistreated the most saved me, not because I deserved it, but because it was right." He glanced toward Marcus, who sat in the pews, his head bowed. "I can't erase the years I spent in arrogance. I can't take back the words I said. But I can say this. Marcus Johnson showed me what real strength looks like. It's not in power or money or control. It's in kindness. It's in grace. And if this town will allow me, I want to spend the rest of my days living that truth." The church fell silent. Then slowly people began to clap. It wasn't thunderous applause, but it was heartfelt, cautious yet hopeful. For the first time, William didn't feel the need for admiration. What mattered was that he had spoken the truth. At home, Daniel began to see his father differently. The man who had once belittled his ideals now listened when he spoke. The divide between them, though not fully healed, began to narrow. Daniel even joined his father on visits to Marcus's workshop, where the two men sometimes shared quiet conversations about work, life, and family. One evening, Margaret found William sitting by the window watching the sunset. "You've changed," she said softly, almost as if she couldn't believe it herself. William turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I had to. The man I was, he wasn't living. He was just surviving on pride. Marcus gave me back more than my life. He gave me a chance to start over." Margaret smiled faintly, tears glistening in her eyes. For years she had prayed for her husband's heart to soften. Now at last she saw the answer to that prayer. Marcus, too, noticed the change. Though cautious at first, he slowly accepted William's gestures of humility. He didn't forget the pain of the past, but he chose not to let bitterness define him. And when William showed consistency, not just words but actions, Marcus extended a quiet forgiveness. The town itself began to shift. Inspired by Marcus's dignity and William's transformation, conversations about fairness and equality grew louder. People who had once remained silent began to speak up. Younger generations felt encouraged, seeing that even those set in their ways could change. For William, redemption was not a single moment, but a daily choice. Every time he treated Marcus with respect, every time he humbled himself in front of others, he took another step toward becoming the man he should have been all along. And though Marcus never sought the spotlight, his influence rippled across Willow Creek. He had shown not just William, but the entire town. That kindness is stronger than hate, and grace can heal even the deepest wounds. The months rolled on, and winter settled over Willow Creek. The town streets glistened with frost in the mornings, smoke curled from chimneys, and neighbors gathered close to keep warm. But beneath the surface of daily life, something deeper had begun to shift. The story of William Carter and Marcus Johnson was no longer just whispered about at the diner or spoken of quietly at church. It had become a tale of transformation, one that resonated across the community. People who had long felt overlooked or mistreated now carried themselves with a little more dignity, knowing Marcus's example was proof that respect could not be denied forever. And people who had once carried prejudice began questioning themselves, asking hard questions about fairness and humanity. For William, the challenge was to live out this change consistently. His body healed slowly, but his spirit grew stronger every day. He no longer hid behind pride. Instead, he looked for ways to use his position not for control, but for good. One frosty evening, Marcus was surprised to find William at his doorstep, bundled in a coat, leaning on a cane rather than sitting in his wheelchair. Margaret stood behind him, smiling faintly. "Evening, Marcus," William said, his breath visible in the cold. "I was hoping we could talk. Not about work. About something bigger." Marcus invited them inside. Angela served coffee, while Naomi and Caleb sat quietly, curious about the unexpected guests. William looked around the warm, modest home, and then back at Marcus. "I've been thinking," he began. "This town, our town, it's full of hardworking people. But not everyone gets the same chance to rise. I've been part of the problem, but I want to be part of the solution. What if we started something together? A program, mentorship, apprenticeships, a way to give young folks opportunities no matter who they are or where they come from." Marcus raised his eyebrows. "You want us to work together on this?" "Yes," William said firmly. "Because I can't do it alone, and because you're the one this town respects, Marcus. They'll listen to you. They'll believe you. If we build this together, maybe Willow Creek can be a place where no one feels unseen." Angela, listening quietly, smiled. She had seen Marcus carry the burden of quiet strength for years. Now here was William, once his enemy, asking to share that burden. Marcus leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "If we do this, it won't just be words. It'll take real commitment. We'll have to face people who don't want change. Are you ready for that?" William nodded. "I'm ready. Because if you could save me when I gave you nothing but grief, then I can stand with you now when it matters." And so, the seed was planted. The following weeks were filled with planning. William and Marcus met in town halls, in church basements, and at the construction site after hours. They drafted ideas for training programs, scholarships, and community events. Their goal was simple but profound: to break down the invisible walls that divided Willow Creek. At first, there was resistance. Some townsfolk muttered that William had lost his mind. Others scoffed at the idea of change. But slowly, momentum built. The younger generation especially rallied around the vision. They wanted a future defined not by prejudice but by opportunity. One snowy Saturday, the town gathered in the school gymnasium for the first community forum. The bleachers were full: farmers in worn coats, shopkeepers in aprons, teenagers in hoodies, church families dressed neatly for the occasion. Marcus stepped onto the stage first, his presence commanding without needing to raise his voice. He spoke of his own journey, of years of hard work and quiet endurance. He didn't dwell on the pain but emphasized the power of perseverance and the importance of lifting others up. Then William took the microphone. There were murmurs, some still skeptical, but he stood tall, his cane steady in his hand. "I was blind for too long," he admitted. Blind to the dignity of the man standing beside me. Blind to the worth of so many people in this town. But Marcus saved my life, and in doing so, he opened my eyes. I don't want my second chance to go to waste. Together, we're building something new. A Willow Creek where every person has a place, a voice, and a future. The crowd erupted in applause. Some clapped politely, others with genuine enthusiasm. But in that moment, the foundation was laid. Over the next few months, the program took shape. Local businesses joined in, offering internships. Retired teachers volunteered to tutor kids who needed extra help. The church hosted workshops on financial literacy, while Carter Construction opened its doors to train young men and women in skilled trades. For Marcus, it was a dream he never thought he'd see come true. For William, it was redemption in action. Their partnership became a living testimony to the town. Enemies could become allies. Prejudice could give way to respect, and brokenness could lead to healing. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Marcus and William sat outside the workshop, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "You know," Marcus said with a faint smile, "if someone had told me 2 years ago we'd be sitting here like this, I'd have laughed in their face." William chuckled softly. "I would have too. But maybe that's the point. Sometimes the biggest miracles are the ones we never see coming." They sat in silence for a while, two men from different worlds bound by a shared purpose. And as the crickets sang and the night air cooled, it became clear that what had begun as a story of conflict and survival had grown into something far G. Spring arrived in Willow Creek like a breath of fresh air. The snow melted, the rivers flowed freely again, and with the new season came visible signs of change. The community mentorship program that Marcus and William had started was no longer just an idea on paper. It was alive. The old school gym, once used only for basketball games and the occasional town fair, now buzzed with energy every weekend. Teenagers gathered there to learn carpentry, welding, and mechanics from Carter Construction's crew. Retired farmers taught gardening and sustainable farming techniques. Mothers ran literacy circles for children, while business owners came to mentor young entrepreneurs. And at the heart of it all were Marcus Johnson and William Carter. Side by side, their unlikely partnership had captured the imagination of the town. People who had once dismissed the idea of change now sent their children to participate. What began as a small initiative was growing into a movement that crossed racial, social, and generational lines. Marcus walked through the gym one Saturday morning, stopping to watch Caleb hammer nails into a wooden frame under William's guidance. Daniel, William's son, stood beside them explaining how to measure angles. The sight made Marcus pause. Years ago, he had worried that William's influence would push Daniel down the same bitter path. Now he saw the boy teaching his son with patience and respect. Angela stood at the back talking with Margaret about a new scholarship fund they were organizing. Naomi ran around with other children, her laughter echoing across the gym walls. For Marcus, the moment felt almost unreal, like a glimpse of the future he had always wanted for his family. Later that afternoon, the community gathered for the program's first public showcase. Families filled the bleachers, eager to see what their children had been learning. On stage, teenagers proudly displayed birdhouses they had built, quilts they had sewn, and artwork that reflected their hopes for Willow Creek's future. One young girl stepped up to the microphone, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each word. "I used to think I didn't matter," she said, "but being part of this program showed me that I have a voice. That I can create, I can lead, and I can dream bigger than I thought. The crowd erupted in applause, and Marcus felt his throat tighten. He glanced at William, who was clapping just as hard, his eyes shining with emotion. As the event ended, the mayor of Willow Creek approached Marcus and William. "What you two have built here," she said, "isn't just a program. It's a lifeline. I'd like to propose making this an official town initiative, with funding, with resources, with real support." The words sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd. For Marcus, it was validation that their efforts were more than temporary. For William, it was proof that redemption wasn't just possible. It could ripple outward to transform an entire community. That night, after everyone had gone home, Marcus and William sat outside on the steps of the gym listening to the crickets. The moon cast a gentle glow over the quiet streets. "You ever think about how far we've come?" William asked, his voice low. "A year ago, I wouldn't have even shaken your hand, and now you're the reason I still get to see my family. The reason I even have a chance to do something that matters." Marcus chuckled softly. "Life's funny that way. Sometimes it takes being broken to finally see what needs fixing." William nodded slowly. "You gave me more than my life, Marcus. You gave me a chance to leave something good behind. I used to think my legacy would be the buildings I constructed, but now I know. It's the lives we help build." Marcus looked out at the quiet town, his heart full. And this is just the beginning. Summer returned to Willow Creek with golden fields and long, warm evenings. By now, the town's mentorship and training program had become more than just a local success. It had become a story that neighboring towns wanted to learn from. Reporters began to visit. Articles were written in regional newspapers about the unlikely partnership between William Carter, once known for his stubborn pride, and Marcus Johnson, the man who had saved his life. The headlines spoke of healing, redemption, and unity in a time when division still lingered in many parts of America. For Marcus, the attention was humbling. He had never sought the spotlight, but now people were calling him a leader, even a hero. For William, the attention was both uncomfortable and redemptive. He knew the man described in those articles was not the man he had always been, but he wanted desperately to live up to this new version of himself. One Saturday morning, buses from nearby towns rolled into Willow Creek. Families, pastors, community organizers, and even business leaders gathered at the school gym to see the program in action. Marcus and William welcomed them, guiding them through workshops where children proudly displayed projects and adults shared testimonies of how their lives had been touched. A young boy from another town pulled on Marcus's sleeve. "Sir," he said shyly, "do you think we could have something like this where I live?" Marcus crouched down to meet his eyes. "You don't have to wait for someone else to start it. You can be the beginning, and we'll help you." The boy's eyes widened with hope, and Marcus felt a warmth in his chest. This was why they had started. That evening, a town-wide dinner was held in the community park. Long tables were set up under strings of lights, and families brought homemade dishes. Laughter, music, and the smell of barbecue filled the air. It was the kind of gathering that once seemed impossible in Willow Creek, but now felt natural. During the dinner, the mayor stepped up to the microphone. "Tonight," she said, "we celebrate not just what this program has done for Willow Creek, but what it represents for every community willing to choose hope over hate and unity over division. And we owe that to two men who chose forgiveness and courage." She motioned for Marcus and William to come forward. The crowd erupted in applause, cheers echoing into the night. William leaned on his cane, his steps slow but steady. Marcus walked beside him, his presence strong and calm. Together they stood before the people. William cleared his throat. "I don't deserve your applause," he began. "For years I lived in blindness, but a man I mistreated gave me his kindness instead of hate. That choice didn't just save my life, it saved my soul. If there's anything I've learned, it's this. True strength isn't in standing above others. It's in standing beside them." Marcus then stepped forward. "I never saved William to be praised. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and that's what we need in this world. More people willing to do right even when it's hard. If we keep choosing grace over bitterness, forgiveness over hate, then we can build a better future, not just for ourselves, but for our children." The applause that followed wasn't just noise, it was a declaration. A recognition that what these two men had built was bigger than themselves. In the weeks that followed, Marcus and William began traveling to other towns. They shared their story in community centers, schools, and churches. Some audiences listened with tears, others with skepticism, but everywhere they went, people left with something to think about. Daniel often accompanied them, helping organize events and sharing his own perspective as the son who had witnessed his father's transformation. Caleb sometimes joined too, learning what it meant to see his father not only as a worker but as a leader in his community. And back in Willow Creek, the program flourished. Naomi and the other children grew up in a world shaped by the example of two men who had once stood on opposite sides but had chosen to walk together. One quiet evening, Marcus and William sat on the porch of the Carter farmhouse, sipping coffee as the fireflies danced in the fields. "Funny, isn't it?" William said softly. "We started as enemies, and now, I don't know what I'd call us." Marcus smiled faintly. "I'd call us brothers. Not by blood, but by choice." William's eyes glistened. He nodded slowly. "Brothers. I like that." They sat in silence, two men who had crossed an ocean of division and found common ground on the other side. And in that stillness, it became clear. Their story was no longer just about survival or redemption. It was about legacy, a legacy of kindness, a legacy of grace, a legacy that would ripple outward, touching lives long after they were gone. Years passed in Willow Creek, and the small town grew in ways no one could have imagined. The mentorship program blossomed into a regional initiative, reaching towns across the state. Thousands of children and families found opportunities they never thought possible, and at the center of it all remained two names spoken with reverence: Marcus Johnson and William Carter. Time, however, is relentless. William's body, already weakened from his accident, grew frailer with each passing year. His cane became a crutch, and eventually he needed a wheelchair once again. Marcus, though strong, carried the visible marks of age too, silver streaks in his hair. Slower steps, but a fire in his spirit that never dimmed. One autumn afternoon, as golden leaves fell across Willow Creek, William sat on the porch of the Carter farmhouse. Marcus arrived, his stride steady, carrying a basket of apples from his orchard. They had made it a tradition, sharing the harvest, sitting together, reflecting on how far they had come. "Remember when we could barely stand to be in the same room?" William chuckled, his voice raspy with age. Marcus laughed, shaking his head. "I remember when you wouldn't even look me in the eye." They both fell silent, the weight of the past resting lightly between them, not as a wound anymore, but as a reminder of how far they had traveled. As evening settled, Margaret joined them with blankets, and Daniel came by with his own children. Caleb, now a grown man, stopped in too, bringing his wife and a newborn baby girl. Naomi, radiant with hope, had become a teacher, dedicating her life to passing forward the lessons of dignity and compassion. The porch filled with laughter, the voices of children mixing with the hum of cicadas. It was a picture of legacy, proof that seeds of kindness once planted could bear fruit for generations. But seasons change, and eventually, the time came when William's health declined sharply. Surrounded by his family, with Marcus seated close by, William spoke his final words with a trembling voice. "I wasted so much of my life being blind, but the years I had after that storm, those were the years that mattered. Marcus, you gave me that gift. You taught me what it means to truly live." Marcus reached for his hand, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We taught each other, William. You chose to change, and that choice gave us both a new story." With a faint smile, William Carter passed peacefully, leaving behind not only his family, but a town forever changed by his transformation. At his funeral, the church was overflowing. People came from across the state. Those who had been mentored through the program, leaders who had been inspired by their story, families who had found hope in their example. The pastor spoke not only of William's redemption, but of the friendship that had defined his final years. Marcus stood to speak, his voice carrying through the sanctuary. "William was not a perfect man. Neither am I. But what matters most is not who we were yesterday, it's who we choose to be today. He chose grace. He chose humility. And because of that, he left this world better than he found it." Tears filled the eyes of many in the congregation, for they all knew the truth. This was not just William's story, nor Marcus's. It was their story too, the story of a town that had learned to rise above division and embrace something greater. Years later, When Marcus himself grew old and his steps slowed to a shuffle, he often walked past the community center now named the Carter Johnson Hall of Hope. The plaque outside bore both of their names, side by side, as a reminder of what forgiveness and courage could accomplish. Children still played there. Teenagers still learned skills and families still gathered to share meals and laughter. Marcus would sit on a bench nearby, watching, knowing that the legacy he and William had built would outlive them both. And when Marcus's time finally came, the town honored him as it had honored William, with gratitude, with tears, but most of all with hope. For together the two men had proven that no heart was too hard to be softened, no past too broken to be redeemed. Their story lived on, told around dinner tables, in classrooms, and in churches, not as a tale of tragedy, but as a beacon of what America could be when kindness triumphed over hate. And so in Willow Creek and far beyond, the legacy of Marcus Johnson and William Carter endured, a legacy written not in stone or steel, but in the hearts of all who had been touched by their journey.